So when you look at a political map of the world,
Hmm.
there is this very comforting illusion of
Oh,
permanence.
absolutely. The clean lines.
Right, you see those neatly colored shapes, the
Mm.
pinks, the greens, the yellows, and it feels like looking at, the architectural blueprints of a house.
Yeah, like this is the living room, that's the kitchen.
Exactly. Solid walls. We operate under this assumption that the world is just this neatly organized collection of exactly 195 sovereign boxes,
Mm.
where everything is orderly, contained, and, well, entirely predictable.
Which is, I mean, it is the ultimate administrative fantasy. We crave categorization. But the reality is that those colored lines in the map are incredibly porous.
Yeah.
And in many cases, they're entirely fictional when it comes to how power actually moves, because the forces that drive global events, the real machinery of the world, they rarely respect those boundaries.
Which becomes incredibly obvious the moment you step away from the map and actually look at the news.
Right.
You see a transnational political movement organized entirely on encrypted internet forums, just toppling a regional government.
Hmm.
Or you see a supply chain bottleneck halfway across the globe, instantly doubling the price of wheat in your local grocery store.
Yeah, or carbon emissions from one continent completely altering the sea level of another. Suddenly, those solid walls look a lot more like a chain link fence.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, because the international system is really this dynamic hidden matrix. And understanding how that matrix functions is, well, it's no longer just an academic exercise reserved for diplomats in suits.
Not at all. It is the operating system of our daily lives.
And that is exactly what we are dissecting today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at the architecture of the global stage, the actual mechanics of international relations.
We're drawing from a really foundational text today, compiled by leading scholars like Stephen McGlinchey, Eric Ringmar, and their colleagues.
Right, but our objective here isn't to read you a textbook. We want to demystify the global system for you. We really want to understand the rules of the game for the planet.
And to do that, you have to start with the most fundamental question. How did we go from a chaotic planet of overlapping local kingdoms and empires to this hyper-connected globe of sovereign states?
Because to understand the current operating system of the world, you basically have to look at the legacy code.
Exactly. You have to go back to the moment the modern board was actually set up, which requires traveling back to medieval Europe.
Okay, let's go there.
And to your earlier point about the map, medieval Europe was the complete antithesis of clean lines. It was just a massive, complicated web of overlapping loyalties and jurisdictions.
When I try to picture the medieval power structure, it always looks like an organizational chart designed by a madman. I mean, you didn't just report to one government.
No, not at all. Political power was incredibly fractured. It was strictly local, but it was simultaneously claimed by these massive universal institutions.
Right.
So imagine you're a merchant in a European town. You owed taxes and loyalty to your local feudal lord.
Makes sense.
But your town might also be part of an independent merchant league that, set its own trade laws. And floating above all of this secular local power were two continent-spanning institutions.
The heavy hitters.
Right. The Catholic Church, led by the Pope, and the Holy Roman Empire.
So you have a local lord demanding your grain, an emperor demanding your military service, and a pope demanding your spiritual obedience and your tithes.
And those demands were constantly in conflict. Because the Pope claimed universal spiritual authority, which, often bled over into political authority,
Of course.
while the emperor claimed universal secular authority. So it was just a recipe for structural friction. There was absolutely no concept of sovereignty as we know it today.
Meaning no idea that a single ruler had absolute exclusive authority over a defined piece of territory. But a system with that much built-in friction is, well, it's eventually going to tear itself apart. Which brings us to the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. We usually hear about this in school as a massive religious conflict sparked by the Reformation. But scholars point to it as the actual birth of the modern state. Why this specific war?
Because the 30 Years' War, which ran from 1618 to 1648, it was the breaking point of that entire medieval web.
Huh.
The Reformation was the catalyst, sure.
Mm.
When rulers embraced Protestantism, they were essentially declaring political independence from the universal authority of the Pope, but fundamentally this was a war over hegemony.
Over who gets to run things.
Yes. It was a brutal existential struggle over who was going to dominate the European continent. And it was unimaginably destructive. I mean, some regions of what is now Germany lost a third of their population to violence, famine, and disease.
A third. That is just staggering. which leads to 1648 in the Treaty of Westphalia. And this is the moment the reset button finally gets hit.
Westphalia is literally the cornerstone of international relations. The rulers of Europe were so exhausted by decades of bloodshed that they basically agreed to a fundamentally new set of rules.
They invented the sovereign state.
They did. From that point forward, international politics was explicitly about relations between states.
And we all know the basic definition of sovereignty, right? Like, you control your own borders. But the implications of Westphalia go much deeper than just drawing lines on a map. It established a principle of formal equality that completely destroyed that old medieval hierarchy.
It absolutely did. Sovereignty means that a state has the exclusive right to rule its territory. No outside power, no pope, no emperor can dictate what happens inside your borders.
Right.
But the revolutionary part was the concept of formal legal equality. On paper, under the Westphalian system, a tiny little principality has the exact same sovereign rights as a massive globe-spanning empire.
So there is no longer a supreme authority. Which brings us to the concept of anarchy. And this is where the terminology of IR can be really counterintuitive. When you or I hear anarchy, we picture a post-apocalyptic movie.
Chaos in the streets.
Yeah, broken windows, total lawlessness. But in the context of the global stage, anarchy is simply a structural fact, isn't it?
Yeah, anarchy in international relations is a technical term. It doesn't imply chaos or rioting. It describes the absence of a central, overarching authority.
Okay.
Because Westphalia made every state completely sovereign and formally equal, there is no entity above the state. There is no global government.
Right.
There is no supreme police force that can compel a state to do something against its will.
I would think of it as a neighborhood that doesn't have a police department. If your neighbor decides to build a fence 10 feet over your property line, or worse, they start threatening your family, you can't just pick up the phone and dial 911.
Because there is no 911.
Exactly. You are forced into a position where you either have to defend yourself with whatever weapons you have, or you have to knock on other neighbors' doors to form a neighborhood watch.
That analogy gets right to the heart of what scholars call the security dilemma. Because there is no 9/11, the international system is inherently precarious. Survival is never guaranteed.
So everyone is on edge.
Constantly. So states must rely on self-help. They build up their militaries to protect themselves. But here is the dilemma.
Okay.
When you build up your military purely for defensive reasons, your neighbor looks at those new weapons and feels threatened. So they build up their military in response.
Which forces you to build more weapons, and suddenly you are in a massive arms race, even if neither of you actually wants a war.
Precisely. The anarchy of the system forces rational actors into highly aggressive postures.
And forming that neighborhood watch is what we call balancing power through alliances.
Right. And the entire history of international relations since 1648 is basically a history of states trying to navigate this anarchic environment, just constantly calculating and recalculating the balance of power to ensure their own survival.
But the state they created in 1648 at Westphalia was essentially just a mechanical bureaucracy, wasn't it? It was an extraction machine designed to collect taxes and fund professional armies. It lacked a soul.
Oh, definitely. The soul didn't arrive until the late 18th century.
With the nation-state.
Yes. The arrival of the nation-state completely altered the math of global power. The American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789 introduced the concept of the nation.
Meaning a group of people with a shared identity.
Right, a shared culture and a sense of collective destiny.
So the state is the hardware, the borders, the institutions, the military.
Yeah.
But the nation is the software. It's the identity running on that hardware.
That's a perfect way to put it. And when you combine the two, the result is incredibly potent.
How so?
Well, before the French Revolution, European kings fought wars with relatively small armies of paid professionals or mercenaries. The average peasant didn't care who won, they just wanted to avoid getting trampled.
They weren't invested in the brand.
Exactly. But the revolutionary French government introduced the levée en masse universal conscription fueled by patriotism. They harnessed the soul of the nation to the machinery of the state.
So suddenly Napoleon is marching across Europe, not with a small band of mercenaries, but with a massive army of citizens who actually believe in the cause of the French nation.
And it completely upended the Westphalian balance of power. It forced every other major power in Europe to adopt the nation-state model just to survive.
You had to get your own people fired up.
You had to mobilize your own population, create your own national mythologies, and build your own patriotic educational systems just to compete on the battlefield.
Okay, so we have a world filled with these fiercely independent, highly mobilized, heavily armed nation-states. And as we established, they exist in a state of anarchy with no global police. The obvious question is, why aren't they just at war constantly?
Right.
How does this entire system not just burn to the ground every 10 years?
Because states developed connective tissue to manage all that friction, and that connective tissue is diplomacy.
Oh, okay.
The military theorist Karl von Clausewitz famously wrote that war is the continuation of policy by other means. Diplomacy is the everyday, peaceful equivalent of that.
It's how they talk instead of shoot.
It is the mechanism by which states communicate, negotiate, pursue their objectives, and desperately try to avoid the catastrophic costs of mutual destruction.
And the stakes of mutual destruction have literally never been higher than during the Cold War. Let's look at the ultimate test of diplomacy: nuclear proliferation.
Yeah, that's the ultimate stress test.
In the mid-20th century, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are locked in this ideological struggle, and they are armed with weapons that can literally extinguish human civilization.
The introduction of nuclear weapons fundamentally changed the nature of anarchy. It birthed the doctrine of deterrence.
Mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
ME.
Right. The logic of deterrence is that you prevent an attack by guaranteeing massive, unacceptable retaliation. The idea was, if you launch your missiles at me, my silos will survive long enough to launch a counterstrike that will turn your cities to ash.
It's the geopolitical equivalent of two people standing in a room ankle deep in gasoline. One has 3 matches, the other has 5. Doesn't matter who has more matches. If anyone strikes one, they both burn.
That is a terrifyingly accurate description of the razor's edge the world lived on. And in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, humanity nearly fell off that edge.
Yeah.
The Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev found themselves in a terrifying standoff.
And what's crucial here is how they walked back from the brink. Because it wasn't the United Nations passing a sternly worded resolution that saved the world.
Not at all.
It was intense, high-stakes diplomacy happening entirely in the shadows.
Publicly, both leaders had painted themselves into corners. They couldn't afford to look weak to their own domestic political bases or to their global allies.
Right, they had to look tough.
But privately, through back channels, sometimes literally involving journalists and spies passing messages in restaurants, they negotiated a compromise.
What was the deal?
The Soviets agreed to publicly remove their missiles from Cuba, and the United States secretly agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey.
So they found a way to satisfy the core security needs of both states without, triggering the gasoline. And the terror of that moment actually spurred incredible diplomatic momentum, right?
It did. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev were deeply traumatized by how close they had come to a miscalculation. It led directly to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline.
The famous red phone.
Exactly, a direct, secure communication link to prevent future misunderstandings.
And that momentum eventually produced the 1970 Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which, when you really look at it, is a masterpiece of pragmatic diplomacy.
It really is.
Because the idealistic goal would have been to ban nuclear weapons entirely. But the diplomatic reality was that the countries that had them were never, ever going to give them up.
Right. The NPT is the perfect example of diplomacy recognizing the limits of the possible. Instead of aiming for an impossible universal disarmament, it structured a grand bargain. It basically froze the board.
How so?
It legally recognized 5 nuclear weapon states: the U.S., the Soviet Union, the U.K., France, and China. Those 5 were permitted to keep their arsenals.
Which is incredibly unequal. They basically pulled the ladder up behind them.
Structurally, yes, it is often called nuclear apartheid, but systemically, it was a necessary triage.
What was the trade-off for the rest of the world?
Well, in exchange for non-nuclear states agreeing never to build weapons, the nuclear states agreed to share peaceful civilian nuclear technology like reactors for power generation with the rest of the world. And they included a vague promise to eventually work toward disarmament.
Which hasn't exactly happened.
No, but despite its inherent inequalities, the NPT is largely why we don't have 40 nuclear-armed states today.
But the NPT worked because it froze a specific moment in time. What happens when the old diplomatic playbook no longer works? Let's look at a much more recent example that challenges everything about how states communicate. Let's talk about U.S.-Iran relations.
Okay, to understand the modern diplomatic standoff with Iran, you really cannot start with the present day. You have to understand the historical baggage starting in 1953.
Right.
During the early days of the Cold War, the U.S. and Britain engineered a coup to overthrow Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh.
Because he nationalized the Iranian oil industry, which the British controlled.
Exactly. The Western powers wanted to ensure access to oil and establish a reliable anti-communist bulwark in the Middle East. So they consolidated power under Iran's monarch, the Shah.
And he ruled for a long time.
For the next 25 years. The Shah was a staunch U.S. ally, heavily armed by Washington, but he was also a brutal autocrat who heavily suppressed domestic opposition.
Which acts like a pressure cooker. You cap the pressure for decades, and eventually it explodes.
Yes.
And that explosion was the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The Shah is overthrown, the Islamic Republic is established, and we get the hostage crisis. Iranian students overrun the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and hold American diplomats hostage for 444 days. Now, beyond the immediate human tragedy of that, why did this specific act send such a massive shockwave through the entire international system?
Because it violated the most foundational ancient rule of the Westphalian system. Even in a state of pure anarchy, rival states must retain the ability to communicate. Therefore, for centuries, the concept of diplomatic immunity has been absolutely sacred. Embassies are considered inviolable. The host country's police or military cannot enter an embassy without permission, and diplomats cannot be arrested or prosecuted by the host nation.
You see this play out even today. Think about Julian Assange hiding in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. The British government wanted him desperately. They spent millions of pounds stationing police officers right outside the front door for years. But they couldn't just walk in and grab him.
Because doing so would shatter the absolute norm of diplomatic immunity. The entire operating system of international relations relies on that immunity.
So Iran basically broke the oldest rule in the book.
By taking the diplomats hostage, the new Iranian government wasn't just striking a blow against the United States, they were signaling a complete rejection of the established rules of the global game. It severed direct relations between the U.S. and Iran for decades, turning them into bitter adversaries.
Okay, so cut to the 2000s. The U.S. is fresh off invading Iraq, and rumors are swirling that Iran is secretly developing a nuclear weapons program.
The rhetorical temperature is just boiling at this point.
Yeah, the U.S. is actively threatening military strikes. So how in the world did we get from that hyper-aggressive posture to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal?
This is where we see the evolution of modern multilateral diplomacy. It wasn't just two superpowers staring each other down. In 2003, when the U.S. completely refused to engage directly with Iran, 3 European Union nations stepped in.
The EU3. The UK, France, and Germany.
Exactly. They acted as the circuit breaker.
Wow, them.
The EU recognized that another massive war in the Middle East would be absolutely catastrophic for European security and the global economy. So they initiated high-level, complex diplomacy, essentially stalling Iran's program and keeping the diplomatic channel alive for years.
Buying time.
Yes. And eventually they managed to pull the U.S., Russia, and China into the negotiations.
You know, the human element of these massive, abstract negotiations is just fascinating to me. I was reading about the final push for the 2015 deal. You had the lead U.S. negotiator, Wendy Sherman, and her Iranian counterpart, Abbas Araghchi, representing 2 nations that had officially viewed each other as the absolute enemy for nearly 40 years.
Right.
Yet, during the grueling late-night sessions, they were supposedly sharing photos of their newborn grandchildren with each other. You had U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry reflecting on his experiences fighting in Vietnam to articulate his commitment to avoiding another war.
Those personal connections are vital. They're essential for building the stamina required to push through deadlocks. But we must be very clear. Successful diplomacy between adversaries is never based on trust.
No.
It is entirely based on verification.
You don't just shake hands and take their word for it.
Never. The 2015 Iran deal wasn't signed because the U.S. and Iran suddenly trusted one another's intentions. It was signed because they engineered an incredibly intrusive, unprecedented system of international inspections by the IAEA.
They found a highly technical compromise.
Exactly. Iran received relief from crippling economic sanctions, and the international community received verifiable physical limitations on Iran's centrifuges and uranium stockpiles to basically prevent a nuclear breakout.
What strikes me about the Iran negotiations is the role of the European Union, because diplomacy traditionally happens state to state. But here, an organization of states played the pivotal role in launching the process.
Yes, they did.
Which forces the question, who actually runs the world today? because it is clearly not just 195 isolated states making decisions in a vacuum.
To understand the modern world, you have to look beyond the state. International relations scholars use a framework developed by Kenneth Waltz, often called the images or levels of analysis.
Okay, let's break that down.
It's a tool for diagnosing why international events happen by looking at three distinct layers: the individual, the state, and the international system.
Let's test this framework. Let's look at something massive, like the 2008 global financial crisis.
Good example.
If I'm using Waltz's levels, whose fault is it? Is it the fault of individual greedy Wall Street bankers? Is it the fault of the U.S. state for passing sweeping financial deregulation? Or is it the fault of the overarching capitalist system that incentivizes unchecked global capital flows?
A rigorous IR scholar will tell you it is the complex integration of all three.
So you can't just pick one.
No. If you only look at the first image of the psychology and decisions of individual bankers or politicians, you miss the laws that allowed them to act that way.
Right.
If you only look at the second image, the domestic politics of the United States, you miss how interconnected global markets amplified the crisis worldwide.
The contagion effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You must view the event through the systemic level, analyzing the global distribution of economic power while recognizing that individuals and states are the ones actually pulling the levers.
And when we look at the systemic level today, we see massive structures floating above the states. Intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs.
Yeah.
And the undisputed heavyweight champion of IGOs is the United Nations. But the UN isn't a world government. Its internal architecture is a direct reflection of raw, global power dynamics, isn't it?
Oh, totally. The UN was forged in 1945 by the victors of World War II. It was designed to prevent World War III, not to create a perfect global democracy.
You definitely see that in its two primary bodies. The General Assembly is kind of the democratic theater, right? Every recognized state has a seat and a single vote.
Right. And it's excellent for passing non-binding resolutions and setting global norms.
But the actual teeth of the UN, the ability to authorize military force or binding sanctions, that lives entirely in the Security Council.
Yes, and the Security Council is fundamentally unequal by design. It has 5 permanent members: the U.S., Russia, China, the U.K., and France. These permanent 5, or P5, hold ultimate veto power.
This is the part that always frustrates people. You can have a resolution supported by 190 countries, and if just one P5 member raises their hand to veto it, the resolution is dead on the floor.
It is incredibly frustrating, and it often paralyzes the UN during major crises, but you have to view it through a realist lens.
How so?
The architects of the UN understood that if the organization could authorize force against a superpower, that superpower would simply leave the UN, just as states abandoned the League of Nations before WWII.
Oh, I see.
The veto is the price of admission. It guarantees that the most powerful military actors remain at the table. It acts as a pressure valve to prevent the UN from accidentally sparking a war between nuclear powers.
Okay, so you have the UN floating above the states. But what about the forces pushing from below? Global civil society and international non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. We're talking about transnational networks of ordinary citizens. How do they wield power if they don't have militaries or the ability to pass binding laws?
NGOs wield the power of persuasion. They operate as norm entrepreneurs. Because they lack hard military power, they rely entirely on information, networking, and framing.
Do you have a good example of
A
that?
classic example is the global campaign to abolish the death penalty.
Which started as a small grassroots movement in Italy, right?
Exactly. It had no state backing initially, but they networked transnationally, connecting with human rights organizations globally. And they utilized 2 specific, highly effective tools: reason-based framing and emotion-based narratives.
Meaning they don't just, hand you a spreadsheet of statistics.
Right, because a spreadsheet doesn't change a politician's mind. They provided the hard data regarding the flaws in judicial systems and the lack of deterrent effect, sure, but they paired that data with intensely personal, emotional stories.
Putting a face to the issue.
They elevated the voices of people exonerated from death row and the families of those executed. They engaged in naming and shaming tactics against states that retained capital punishment.
Yeah, it worked.
Over decades, yes. By leveraging information and moral pressure, they successfully shifted global public opinion and secured backing from the UN General Assembly. They bypassed the traditional state apparatus to completely rewrite a global norm.
Okay, so the board is incredibly crowded. We have 195 states operating in anarchy, nuclear weapons, the UN Security Council veto, and transnational NGOs shifting norms from the bottom up. It sounds like absolute, unpredictable chaos.
It can definitely feel that way.
So how do scholars and policymakers even begin to predict how these actors will behave?
They rely on theoretical lenses. In international relations, we use massive analytical frameworks to filter the noise and identify patterns of behavior. The three dominant lenses are realism, liberalism, and constructivism.
Let's apply these lenses to see how they actually work in practice. Let's take a major geopolitical shift, like the economic and military rise of China over the last few decades. If I'm looking through the lens of realism, what do I see?
A realist looks at the rise of China and sees an inevitable collision. Realism assumes that the international system is purely a zero-sum game of survival.
Every man for himself.
Exactly. States are inherently selfish, rational actors focused entirely on maximizing their relative power. A realist argues that as China's economic and military power grows, it will naturally seek regional hegemony to secure its interests.
And the U.S. won't like that.
The United States, as the existing hegemon, will inevitably view this growth as a direct threat to its own security. Therefore, to a realist, cooperation is an illusion, and structural conflict, whether economic or military, is virtually guaranteed.
That is deeply pessimistic. It essentially says we are trapped by the math of military spending. Now, what if I swap my glasses and look at China's rise through the lens of liberalism?
The liberal lens acknowledges the anarchy of the system, but argues that realists dramatically underestimate the power of institutions and trade to mitigate conflict.
Okay.
A liberal looks at the U.S. and China and sees two economies that are so deeply intertwined by supply chains, massive trade volumes, and financial investments that a direct war would be economic suicide for both.
Mutually assured economic destruction.
Exactly. Furthermore, liberals point out that integrating a rising power into international organizations like the World Trade Organization creates shared rules and regular communication. To a liberal, absolute gains matter more than relative gains.
So if both countries are getting richer through trade, the incentive for war plummets.
Precisely.
So realism sees inevitable conflict over dominance. Liberalism sees economic interdependence acting as a straitjacket against war. Now, the third lens is constructivism, which always feels a bit philosophical to me. The famous quote from Alexander Wendt is, "Anarchy is what states make of it." How does constructivism explain state behavior?
Constructivism argues that both realists and liberals focus way too much on material facts like the number of tanks or the volume of trade and ignore the social reality of the world.
The social reality.
Constructivists argue that ideas, historical relationships, norms, and shared identities dictate how states perceive those material facts.
I think the best way to understand constructivism is to look at nuclear arsenals.
Let's hear it.
The United Kingdom has a highly advanced nuclear weapons program. Does the United States government lose sleep over British nukes? Are there emergency meetings in the Pentagon about a UK strike? No.
Right.
But if North Korea tests a single ballistic missile, the entire U.S. defense apparatus goes on high alert.
Exactly. Objectively, materially, the UK possesses a far greater capacity to destroy the United States than North Korea does. But the material facts don't dictate the U.S. response.
Because of the relationship.
Yes. The shared identity and deep historical alliance between the U.S. and the UK construct a reality where British weapons are viewed as friendly assets. The historical animosity between the U.S. and North Korea constructs a reality where even a minor North Korean capability is viewed as an existential threat. The hardware is meaningless without the software of the relationship.
That makes total sense. Now let's take these theoretical lenses and apply them to the concept of international law, because this is where the rubber really meets the road. There is no global parliament passing laws. International law is stitched together through treaties, which are formal agreements, and customary practices. But here is the genuine challenge to the entire concept. If we are in an anarchic system with no global police, isn't international law just a polite suggestion?
That's the classic question.
What actually stops a superpower from invading a smaller neighbor or violating a treaty if they calculate that the benefits outweigh the costs?
You are hitting on the classic realist critique of international law, that it only matters when it aligns with a powerful state's interests. But that critique really ignores how law actually functions on the global stage.
Okay, like me.
International law operates through a normative life cycle. States are deeply concerned with their reputation, their legitimacy, and the principle of reciprocity.
Meaning, if I break a treaty today, no one will sign a trade agreement with me tomorrow.
Exactly. The international system is a repeated game. If you flagrantly violate international law, you become a pariah. Foreign investment dries up, allies distance themselves, and you face economic sanctions. Law creates what scholars call argumentative needs.
What does that mean in practice, argumentative needs?
It means that even when powerful states decide to break international rules, for instance, launching an unauthorized military intervention or utilizing illegal interrogation techniques like torture, they rarely just step up to a podium and say, "We are more powerful than you, so we don't care about the law."
Right, they never say that. They deploy armies of lawyers.
Precisely. They tie themselves into massive legal knots attempting to justify their actions. They will claim their unauthorized invasion was actually an act of preemptive self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter.
They find a loophole.
Or they will draft convoluted legal memos redefining the definition of torture to claim they aren't technically violating the Geneva Conventions. The very fact that superpowers feel compelled to spend vast resources attempting to legally justify their bad behavior proves that the normative framework of international law exerts immense structural pressure.
It's like that quote, "Hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue."
Exactly.
That is a fascinating way to look at it. The law matters because you have to lie to get around it. But the Westphalian system, international law, treaties, all of this assumes that the primary actors are states. Let's pivot to modern threats that completely ignore borders, laws, and state structures entirely. I'm talking about transnational terrorism.
Transnational terrorism is a profound stress test for the state-centric system. Scholars categorize the evolution of terrorism into distinct waves.
Waves?
Yes, previous waves were historically tied to specific localized goals like 19th century anarchism or mid-20th century anti-colonial movements fighting for national independence. But we are currently dealing with the fifth wave, exemplified by groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which is uniquely supercharged by globalization.
It's the dark side of the internet and global connectivity.
It is. They utilize the exact same infrastructure that drives the global economy. Cheap international air travel, real-time global news networks, and encrypted digital communications. They operate on what is essentially a plug-and-play model.
Like franchising a fast food restaurant, but for extremism.
That is a disturbingly accurate analogy. They possess a broad, overarching global ideology, and they can plug that ideology into highly specific local grievances anywhere in the world.
They provide the toolkit.
They provide the brand, the instructional manuals for explosives, and the digital community, allowing isolated individuals or small local militias to operate under a terrifying global banner. Traditional militaries, designed to fight other states with defined borders and supply lines, struggle immensely against a decentralized network.
And the logic behind these attacks is what makes them so insidious. Because it is rarely just blind nihilistic violence. It is highly strategic, isn't it?
Terrorism is fundamentally a communicative act. When a group launches a strike, they are simultaneously speaking to three distinct audiences.
Who are they?
They are speaking to their victims to generate paralyzing fear. They are speaking to their potential recruits to project strength and capability. And most importantly, they are speaking to the target government, utilizing a Foucaultist strategy.
I want to dig into that because it's a concept derived from Che Guevara's guerrilla warfare tactics, right? The idea that a small, focused act of violence can ignite a larger revolution. You're saying these terrorists want the state to freak out.
That is the core terrifying logic. A terrorist network knows it cannot defeat the United States military or the French military on a traditional battlefield. So the goal of a terror attack is often to provoke a massive, disproportionate overreaction from the target state.
They want the state to suspend civil liberties, launch massive surveillance programs, or invade foreign countries.
Because when the state overreacts, when it bombs civilian areas in retaliation, or implements draconian domestic security laws, it alienates the local population. It validates the terrorist narrative that the state is an oppressive, tyrannical monster.
The state does the recruiting for them.
The state's overreaction becomes the terrorist group's greatest recruiting tool. They use the state's own immense power against itself, like a geopolitical judo throw.
Which brings us to the flip side of how states deal with violence within borders. For centuries, the shield of Westphalian sovereignty was absolute. The rule was, nobody looks inside your borders.
Right.
If a dictator was massacring his own citizens, the international community might wring its hands, but legally they viewed it as an internal matter. But the architecture of international relations shifted dramatically regarding human protection recently, didn't it?
It was a seismic paradigm shift, born out of the catastrophic failures of the 1990s. Particularly the Rwandan genocide and the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, where the international community stood by while hundreds of thousands were slaughtered.
and that led to a change of the rules.
In response, in 2005, the United Nations formally adopted the principle of the responsibility to protect, or R2P.
This essentially rewrote the definition of sovereignty.
It did. R2P argues that sovereignty is not an absolute blank check right to do whatever you want to your population. Sovereignty entails a responsibility to protect your citizens.
Yet if you don't?
Crucially, if a state manifestly fails to protect its populations from mass atrocities, specifically genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, or crimes against humanity, the international community has a duty to intervene, up to and including military force. The shield of sovereignty is pierced if the state becomes a monster.
The theory is incredibly noble, but the application of R2P is where the idealism crashes headfirst into realism. Let's look at the stark contrast between two recent conflicts.
Okay.
In 2011, when Muammar Gaddafi was threatening to slaughter civilians in Benghazi, the international community invoked R2P, the UN authorized a no-fly zone, and NATO intervened in Libya. But just a few years later, as the Syrian civil war erupted and the Assad regime began dropping barrel bombs and using chemical weapons on its own people, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths, the international community largely sat on its hands. Why does R2P work in one country and completely fail in another?
Because human protection cannot escape geopolitics. Intervening in a sovereign state requires immense political will, financial resources, and the willingness to risk the lives of your own soldiers.
It's expensive in every way.
In Libya, there was a brief, unique moment of global consensus. However, the NATO intervention quickly expanded beyond protecting civilians into actively removing Gaddafi from power.
Which infuriated Russia and China.
Deeply. They felt the West had abused the R2P mandate for regime change. So when the Syrian crisis escalated, Russia and China were determined not to let it happen again.
They used their veto.
They repeatedly used their P5 veto power in the UN Security Council to block any meaningful intervention or sanctions against the Assad regime, who is a strategic ally of Moscow.
So the noble principle of R2P is basically held hostage by the geopolitical interests of the great powers.
Furthermore, you have to look at the domestic politics of democratic states. Politicians have to justify military interventions to their taxpayers. If a distant humanitarian crisis does not threaten a state's direct national security interests, or if the public is exhausted by previous foreign wars, the political will to intervene simply evaporates, regardless of how horrific the atrocities are. Moral outrage rarely translates into military commitment unless strategic interests are also at stake.
Human security is incredibly fragile. But it isn't just about avoiding a terrorist attack or an ethnic conflict. For the vast majority of people on the planet, human security is about having enough to eat, being able to find a job, and surviving a changing climate.
Absolutely.
Which pulls us into the massive web of the global political economy.
The global economy is shaped by a profound ideological tension. On one side, you have the dominant operating system of the last 40 years, neoliberalism.
This is the philosophy championed by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank.
Exactly. It argues that the path to global prosperity is through free markets, deregulation, privatization, and the removal of trade barriers.
It's the belief that if you remove the friction of state intervention, capital will flow efficiently and lift everyone up.
Right. But on the other side, you have the forces of ultra-globalization. This isn't necessarily a demand to end global connectivity, but a coalition of grassroots movements, labor unions, and environmental NGOs arguing that the neoliberal model is fundamentally broken.
What's their main argument?
They argue that unchecked free markets create massive wealth inequality, exploit vulnerable labor in the global south, and incentivize the destruction of the environment for short-term profit.
The perfect case study for this tension is the 2007-2008 global food crisis. Within a few months, the price of basic staples like rice, wheat, and corn skyrocketed globally. We saw food riots in dozens of countries, from Haiti to Bangladesh.
It was incredibly destabilizing.
Now, the instinctive reaction is to think there was a massive drought and the earth simply didn't produce enough food. But that wasn't the case.
No, the total global food supply was largely adequate. The crisis was a systemic failure of the global political economy. It was a perfect storm of interlocking factors. You had the financialization of food commodities, where Wall Street speculators were driving up futures prices. You had states converting agricultural land from food crops to biofuel crops. You had fragile, just-in-time global supply chains.
It highlighted the brutal disconnect between the global market and local survival. You have a consumer in a wealthy Western nation who simply expects cheap food to always be available at the supermarket, completely insulated from the farmer in the developing world who is crushed when the global commodity price drops, but starves when the retail price spikes.
And crucially, those food riots were not just localized complaints, they sent shockwaves upward. They forced sovereign governments to drastically alter their trade policies, implement export bans, and scramble for food security.
It pushed back on the system.
It proved that bottom-up, marginalized voices, the people often ignored by high-level IR theory, can violently shake the international system when their basic human security is threatened.
And nothing threatens basic human security more universally than the collapse of our shared environment. We are talking about climate change, which feels like the ultimate test of the international system. It is the classic tragedy of the commons.
The tragedy of the commons describes a situation where individuals, acting rationally in their own self-interest, deplete a shared resource, ultimately destroying it for everyone.
And the atmosphere is the commons.
The Earth's atmosphere is the ultimate global commons. Every single sovereign state has a powerful short-term economic incentive to burn cheap fossil fuels, to power its industries, grow its GDP, and increase its national power.
But if every state follows that rational self-interest, the atmosphere warms, the oceans rise, and everyone faces catastrophic consequences. It requires getting 195 fiercely independent, selfish states to willingly sacrifice short-term economic growth for a long-term shared goal. It seems structurally impossible under the rules of Westphalia.
It is the hardest diplomatic challenge in human history, which is why the 2015 Paris Agreement is viewed by many scholars as a monumental, almost miraculous achievement of global governance.
How did they manage it?
The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change managed to thread an impossible needle.
Because previous attempts, like the Kyoto Protocol, tried a top-down approach, right?
Yeah.
Dictating binding targets to states, which immediately triggered their sovereignty defenses.
Exactly. Kyoto failed because you cannot force sovereign superpowers to comply. The Paris Agreement succeeded by flipping the model to a bottom-up approach. It relied on nationally determined contributions.
What does that mean?
Every state came to the table and publicly pledged what they were willing to do voluntarily.
But critics point out that voluntary pledges are basically glorified public relations. There is no enforcement mechanism. If a state misses its carbon reduction target, there is no UN climate police coming to arrest the president.
That is the realist critique, and it is totally valid. But the constructivist counterargument is that the Paris Agreement wasn't designed to be a criminal code. It was designed to send an overwhelming, unified signal to global capital markets.
A signal.
By getting the U.S., China, India, and the European Union to formally agree that the fossil fuel era is ending, it shifted trillions of dollars in private investment toward renewable energy. It created a massive normative expectation. It proves that diplomacy can construct frameworks to address existential threats that no single state can solve alone.
But historically, global governance and international stability haven't just relied on treaties. They have relied on the presence of a hegemon, a single superpower willing to underwrite the rules of the system. Let's look at the future of global security and what life looks like beyond Pax Americana.
Following the devastation of World War II, the United States emerged as the undisputed economic and military hegemon of the Western world, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the sole global superpower.
The U.S. basically wrote the rules.
The U.S. essentially offered the operating system of the modern world. It spearheaded the creation of the UN. It established the Bretton Woods financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank to govern global trade, and its navy secured the global sea lanes to allow free trade to flourish.
And the U.S. backs that up with staggering military capability, spending roughly 40% of the entire world's military budget. But that massive umbrella creates a fascinating and highly controversial dynamic known as the free rider problem.
Because the U.S. provides this global security guarantee, wealthy allied nations such as many members of NATO or strategic partners like Japan and South Korea can afford to spend a relatively small percentage of their GDP on their own defense.
They get the security without the bill.
They receive the benefits of the secure global order without bearing the proportionate financial or military burden.
Which leads to the defining geopolitical question of our current era. Is American hegemony actually sustainable? The U.S. has expended trillions of dollars and thousands of lives in prolonged, highly destabilizing interventions in the Middle East. Domestically, there's a staggering national debt and a profound bipartisan public exhaustion with being the world's policeman. We are seeing a distinct inward turn in American politics.
If the era of Pax Americana is slowly ending, the structural question is, what replaces it? Will we see a peaceful transition of power?
What about China?
China has experienced an unprecedented economic and military rise, but it remains heavily focused on asserting regional dominance in Asia rather than eagerly taking on the expensive, exhausting burdens of global policing.
So if the U.S. steps back and China doesn't fully step up to manage the globe, do we fracture into regional hegemons? A world where China dictates the rules in Asia, Russia exerts violent influence over Eastern Europe, and the U.S. retreats to the Western Hemisphere.
That's a very real possibility.
Or do we slide back into a chaotic multipolar world, similar to the volatile, unstable balance of power that preceded World War I?
The anxiety in international relations today is palpable because the transition away from unipolarity is always dangerous. But we must also recognize that the very nature of power is shifting away from the state entirely.
This is where it gets truly mind-bending. While states are busy arguing over the balance of power, technology is quietly eroding their monopoly on control. Look at the Silk Road dark web bust. To take down a single illegal internet marketplace run by individuals, it required the coordinated effort of law enforcement agencies from 13 different countries speaking 11 different languages.
It was incredibly complex.
Or look at the Arab Spring. Citizens used commercial smartphones and social media platforms to bypass state media, organize massive protests, and topple regimes in a matter of weeks.
Information, capital, and cultural influence now flow across the globe instantaneously, completely bypassing the border guards and customs agents that define the Westphalian state.
I see the current state of international relations like a massive tectonic shift. For nearly 400 years, the sovereign nation-states have been the tectonic plates of the world. They grind against each other, they cause geopolitical earthquakes, they shape the surface of the map.
That's a great visual.
But now it feels like the magma underneath those plates, the technology, the global capital flows, the transnational internet communities, the non-state actors, that magma is moving faster and hotter than ever before. And in some places, it is starting to melt right through the plates.
It is an era of profound disruption. The foundational rules established in 1648 are facing unprecedented stress tests from above, in the form of climate change and global finance, and from below, in the form of digital connectivity and transnational movements.
Let's wrap up this journey. Today, we have dismantled the illusions of the political map. We started in the messy, overlapping loyalties of the medieval world, witnessed the birth of the sovereign state at Westphalia, and navigated the high-stakes nuclear diplomacy of the Cold War and Iran.
We covered a lot of ground.
We've peered into the architecture of the UN Security Council, analyzed the dark strategies of transnational terrorists, and debated the immense challenges of the global food supply and climate change. You are now equipped with the theoretical lenses to see the hidden matrix of world politics.
And the most vital takeaway from all of this is that international relations is not an esoteric game played exclusively by diplomats in bespoke suits, sitting in closed-door sessions in Geneva.
It is the reality you live in every single day. Every time you purchase imported produce, every time you share a piece of information on a global social media platform, every time you cast a vote, you are an active, connected node in the global system.
You are subject to its structural pressures, and collectively you shape its direction.
Which leaves us with one final, provocative thought to consider. Given the overwhelming forces we've explored today, the rise of borderless digital communities, transnational corporations that wield more economic power than most developing nations, and existential, border-blind threats like a changing climate, is it possible that the traditional nation-state will not survive the next century in its current form? We tend to view the state as permanent.
But maybe it isn't.
Are we right now unknowingly living through the painful, messy birth of an entirely new global political structure, a post-Westphalian world that doesn't even have a name yet?
When the magma burns through the plates, the entire landscape changes. The map is being redrawn as we speak.
So, the next time you look at a globe, with its neat, solid colors and perfect borders, remember the magma underneath. The walls are porous, the matrix is active, and you are part of it. Thank you for exploring the hidden architecture of the world with us.